Cameras live in 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Forecast by Invisible Dust program. Today, we have great guests who I'll introduce shortly. But the question that we're focusing on for today's discussion is how can we adapt to uncertainty as the climate changes? Just to give a quick audio description of myself, I have a white background, a green linen shirt, black skin, and short hair. Now, this discussion will explore the ways in which we can adapt to uncertainty, especially as a society that's being faced right now with quite a few crises and accelerating climate change. A reminder of the question again of how can we adapt to uncertainty as the climate changes. I think while the question of this talk can be read as a truism, actually on deeper reflection, it's also a confession. To echo the words of the Chinese-American author Yian Li in her collection of essays, "Dear friend, from my life, I write to you in your life." She writes within it, and in a very plain and powerful way, that knowing is not understanding. And it's exactly this statement that each of our speakers is going to be exploring today. When we are surrounded by uncertainty, which is in itself consistent, why do we fundamentally find it difficult to accept and understand that truth, even when it's given to us in the plainest way? So to introduce our speakers, we have artist Adam Chodzko, who explores our conscious and unconscious behaviours, working across media ranging from large-scale installations to dematerialized interventions. He's exploring the space between documentary and fantasy and is very interested in psychology, conceptualism, and surrealism, the public and the private realms as well. Chodzko's work provokes our collective imagination by wondering how, through the visual, we might best understand and reform our encounters with the society and environment that surrounds us. He's exhibited extensively in international solo and group exhibitions, including Tate Britain, Istanbul Biennial, and Venice Biennial. Adams also has a history of working with invisible dust, having been commissioned for the Great North Run Culture to create Rising, a surround sound and performance piece about flooding at the British Science Festival in Newcastle in 2013. Rising was subsequently performed at the National Maritime Museum, the University of Hull, and the Beiju Triennial in Japan. We also have scientist Kevin Anderson, who's a professor of energy and climate change in the School of Mechanical, Aerospace, and Civil Engineering at the University of Manchester. He was previously the director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Kevin engages widely across all tiers of government, from reporting on aviation-related emissions to the EU Parliament, advising the Prime Minister's Office on carbon trading and contributing to the development of the UK's Climate Change Act. Kevin's work on carbon budgets have been pivotal in revealing the widening gulf between political rhetoric on climate change and the reality of rapidly escalating emissions. And I'd also like to introduce Margaret Heffernan, entrepreneur, CEO, and author of Uncharted, How to Map the Future Together. Dr. Margaret Heffernan produced programs for the BBC for 13 years before moving over to America, where she was listed as one of the top 100 media executives, according to The Hollywood Reporter. She's the author of 6 books, and Margaret's third book, Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Oblivious at Our Peril, was named as one of the most important business books of the decade by the Financial Times. Her recent publication, Uncharted, How to Map the Future, was published in February 2020, ironically, or coincidentally, just before the pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our guests, and we're starting by having them respond to the question, how is uncertainty shaping the future and how we can adopt it? I'd like to start with Margaret, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bianca. I think the truth is, uncertainty has always been with us, but pretty much since the Industrial Revolution, we've become very persuaded that everything that we know can be measured, and if it can be measured, then we can manage it. And we've lived through hundreds of years of scientific management, and in recent years, we've been subjected to a sort of propaganda storm, I would say, by Silicon Valley, convincing us that everything that that matters can be measured. And this is really tricky because the more you start thinking, right, everything that matters can be measured, then anything that can't be measured and accurately predicted, well, obviously it doesn't matter. That makes us really completely lost when it comes to all sorts of complex systems. It makes us lost in finance because we know there will be banking busts in future. We know that for sure, if you like, but we don't know when. We don't know what will provoke it. We don't know why. We don't know where it'll start. Similarly, epidemics, right? We've known they're always with us. We've always known there will be epidemics. But because every epidemic is different, there's no profile of one. We don't know when the next one will start, where it will break out, or what the pathogen will be. So uncertainty is endemic in life. And on some levels in our lives, we love uncertainty. We don't want to know what we're getting for our birthday. We don't want to know, what we're getting for Christmas or for a holiday. We don't want to know when we get married whether our marriage will last. So it's really interesting. The human mind has been dealing with uncertainty since there was a human mind. And in some situations, we see it as fearful and frightening. And in other situations, we see it as opportunity and excitement. So it doesn't have only one face, uncertainty. But I think, when it comes specifically to climate change, I think that our addiction to prediction and our addiction to numbers has really put us in a place that's so complex that we've become paralyzed. I mean, we've known about climate change for at least 30 years now. And it's not news by any manner of means. But I think what people mostly have been doing, and thank goodness it isn't everybody, mostly what people have been doing is waiting for the master plan. Like people know that they can recycle and so on, but they know that isn't going to be enough. So we've seen huge passivity on the part of governments, on the part of businesses, on the part of consumers, because there's a sort of sense of, well, we don't know where to start. This is a nonlinear system. It's full of uncertainty. We don't have a roadmap. We don't know what to do, which, as it turns out, is the perfect alibi for doing absolutely nothing. I think clearly the world has come to realize that waiting for the master plan, if there ever is one, will only come after it's too late, when maybe we'll realize what we should have been doing. I think instead of waiting for a master plan, we have to understand that in complex systems, there's lots that isn't predictable, that's never predictable, that you can't see all the forces that are impacting all the forces, and that therefore you have to start before you know everything, and definitely before you understand everything. Now, I'm a kind of curious blend, I guess. I have, most of my life, the first half of my career was in the arts. The second half of my career has been largely in business. And I think there's a very interesting overlap between entrepreneurs and artists, which is both start doing things before anybody asks them to. Both often sense change before anybody else does. And what I think we can do is learn from both groups of people, if you like, both kinds of mindsets, and realize that actually, when it comes to climate change, we have got to start before all the facts are in. We have got to start before we understand everything. And I'll just touch on a few topics here. One is we have really, really struggled, the scientific community in particular, with how to communicate climate change. And in general, I think the 20 years of a lot of passivity has shown that much of the communication, however well-intentioned it was, hasn't worked terribly well. Now, in a way, the communication has become a mass protest, which on one level is greatly clarifying. But I think we have to recognize that actually everyone we talk to, everyone we work with, everyone we're related to is someone that can be informed and can inform us. I think from my perspective, one of the most fascinating and positive things that's happened in the last couple of years is that we've seen that in the United States, the biggest influencer on white conservative men is their teenage daughters.
Margaret, I'm just going to stop you there, just because that's a really interesting point. And I think we want to also give an opportunity for the audience to respond to that. It's a really, there's really enthusiastic about that. I want to hand over to Kevin, and I will make a note of what you've just said. We'll come back to that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bianca.
No worries.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Uncertainty. Well, to me, really, initially, I thought, well, that's more of a sort of a cafe or a pub discussion. So from a sort of quantum sense, nothing can be truly known. We can never understand the world, and you can really unpick all of everything that we know and say, do we really even exist? But I think that's not particularly helpful for what we're trying to do today. So I was trying to think, well, I'm guessing that Adam and Margaret will come at this from a different perspective. So I thought I'll just wear my prosaic, normal climate change sciencey hat when I think about uncertainty. So this isn't particularly exciting, but I think when we think about uncertainty, we also have to think about certainty, and it's a spectrum. There's a spectrum along that, of which we don't know anything certainly, and probably there are some things that are completely uncertain. So it's sort of known knowns through to unknown unknowns. And I think with that spectrum, then start to think, well, how does that help us address the climate emergency and understand our role both in causing it and potentially in remedying it? So there's sort of cascading levels of uncertainty. And I'm going to think of that in two ways. I'm going to think of it initially in terms of impacts and adaptation, and then through into mitigation. So I'm going to go through these sort of fairly quickly. What do we know with very, very high levels of uncertainty, not complete certainty, with high levels of certainty? We know that climate change is happening. This is nothing new. We know climate change is happening, and we know that since the 50s, if not before, most of that has been caused by the burning of fossil fuels and indeed other greenhouse gases from the agricultural system significantly, and from deforestation. But we know that with a high degree of certainty. We know that carbon dioxide is cumulative, that it builds up in the atmosphere. So every year we fail to do anything about it, that carbon dioxide sits there and it is added to by tomorrow's, and the situation gets worse and worse and worse because it is a cumulative issue. When it comes to impacts, what do we know with high levels of certainty? Well, we know that it's happening. We can measure it. We can see it. We know that since the 50s, as I say, it's significantly burning the fossil fuels. And we know really, in terms of the impacts, that if we just carry on like we are, then the teenagers of today are going to finally, when they get to 70 and 80 years old, be living through 3 to 5 degrees centigrade of warming, a different world. It's not the same planet as this one. We know that with certainty. If we carry on as we're going, and we're choosing not to change that now. We also know with a fairly high degree of certainty, we're not absolutely certain, but high degree of certainty, if we rapidly curtail emissions, we can probably hold warming to 2 degrees centigrade, roughly across the globe, as an average. But let's also be clear, we do know with a high degree of certainty that is absolutely devastating. The best we can achieve is absolutely devastating for many ecosystems around the planet. We also know that even the best that we can achieve, many people will die. Many thousands, potentially even millions will die. And they'll die from a whole set of things, often extreme weather events that are exacerbated by climate change. We also know quite well who those people are. They're typically low emitters, they're poor, and they'll by and large be people of color. And we've known that for a long time, us high emitters, and we haven't cared. What's less certain is whether we can adapt to climate change, even us wealthy ones, whether we can even adapt, and whether we can adapt to it in a way that, in fact, eventually, hopefully, we can learn to live with the changed climate that we've imposed upon ourselves and future generations, and have no more climate deaths as a result. But we don't know about that. That's still highly uncertain. So we then focus on mitigation. What we know for certainty is we have to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, not reduce them, but eliminate them, and rapidly. We also know if we take equity into account and think of the 2 degrees C framing, we need to have zero emissions from the wealthy parts of the world by about 2035 to 2040, much earlier than most people are suggesting, and at a global level by 2050 at the very latest for the poorer countries. We know that technology is a prerequisite of addressing this situation. And as an engineer used to design oil platforms, I like technology. But it is a prerequisite, but far, far from sufficient, because we've chosen to fail so far. So we need massive social and economic change, system level change, brought about almost immediately. We know from where most of the emissions arise. Most of the emissions come from a relatively small group of high emitters. We know that. We don't like it, because those of us who talk about these issues are almost always in that high emitting category. So we know that, but we don't like it. So we have the certain bones of a 2 degree C mitigation agenda. We know we need profound and immediate change in the lifestyles of people like me and other high emitters, immediate and profound. We know we need huge shifts in the physical infrastructure of our society. We know that as well with a high degree of certainty if we're going to stick to 2 degrees centigrade. What is much less certain is how do we initiate that radical change? We have fundamentally failed at every single level for at least 30 years. At every level, we've profoundly failed on climate change. Where are the catalysts? Now, history tells us, do not wait for the top down. Do not have a belief that leadership is something that is up there and then is passed down to the little people beneath. The wealthy and the great and good like to see the world like that, but it isn't how the world is. What we know often from history is that actually a really profound change often starts bottom up. Who'd have thought that 50-year-old Swedish schoolgirl could have more influence on climate change than the head of the UN, than any world leader, or that Rosa Parks had the influence she had, or Mary Manning on apartheid, or go back to the first suffragette movements. Most of the movements of the world start bottom up. But ultimately, of course, to be successful, it has to be a partnership, a messy partnership between bottom up and top down. And that's the development of the policy comes through that change in culture. And this is where we have real uncertainty, but actually where that creative uncertainty exists. And actually in that creative uncertainty of how we develop that partnership, how we're going to do that rapidly and urgently, that's where hope resides. That's where our scope for action exists in driving through that uncertainty, through hope and through action. And that brings the role of a change in society down to all of us. We all have that potential to bring about and initiate change. So I think uncertainty at that level, that's where hope resides.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd like to hand over now to Adam, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Bianca. How can we adapt to uncertainty as the climate changes? How do we adapt to uncertainty in relation to pretty much anything? By recognizing that existence is inherently uncertain, but that's what makes existing both wonderful and challenging. Why are we needing to adapt now to uncertainty? Was anything previously somehow certain, other than that we're in a constant state of uncertainty, change, flux, flow, and indeterminacy? Accelerated climate change is occurring mostly because of our human ability to construct certainties. The certainty that the pursuit of economic growth is somehow a natural state, the certainty that human dominance and control over everything else in the world is the right way, the addictive certainty of greed, that we definitely need more stuff. We've constructed a fantasy of certainty through the particular form of individualistic capitalism we've embraced. Certainty is speedy, it's great for production, it stops discussion about the damaging impact caused by that production. Certainty stifles ambiguity, nuance, care, and empathic attention. It doesn't have time to wait around for us to develop an entangled equality with each other and the more than human. That seems way too slow and confusing. Certainty comforts with its often self-serving, fearful, short-termist simplicity. Make America great again, get Brexit done, take back control. We can't fully comprehend the climate emergency because we are the cause. Just as we find it difficult to acknowledge systemic racism because of white privilege, we've built up a whole body of disavowals inside us around all social inequalities in order to gain a bit of short-term gratification to avoid feeling awkward, uncertain. My work as an artist is about how we perceive each other and the world around us and how we behave in response to these perceptions. My particular interest in climate change is about our psychological response to it, how we intellectually comprehend the data and feel in awe of the imagery, yet manage to talk ourselves out of making any personal behavioral change because of our brain's evolutionary hardwiring, our inability to recognize long-term risk and then take the necessary action to avert it. As a parent, I'm aware that particularly in the UK, young children are encouraged to find certainty about what they want to be when they grow up at an age way before many other societies and way before they've explored and played with all possibilities. And they're encouraged to make all these limiting decisions in the midst of their brains going through their most dramatic and rapid phases of fluctuation and transformation. Then as young adults, they're often racked with anxiety, wondering whether this trajectory they're already so invested in was actually a path to happiness. So we retreat into the certainties of our filter bubbles to alleviate these feelings of discomfort. I'm a visual artist, which supposedly means I live precariously and yet with enough privilege and security to work, or is it play, with a notion of total freedom. But I'm still stuck with having to make multiple creative decisions, short-term certainties in order to act, so that I don't just end up infinitely pondering. But I can't construct a certainty. I've made some really terrible work when I tried this. Instead, I have to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty and patiently allow something to bubble up from my unconscious. It's really slow, but it's also strangely intense because you need to be constantly alert for that fleeting glimpse of possibility. At the end of their writing day, many writers use a technique of leaving their last sentence half finished, an uncertainty suspended overnight, into a dream state, an incentive, a curiosity to continue creating again the next day. Reaching the certainty of a full stop would block that flow. So I'll stop now in the middle of a... Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I really like that literary effect there as a writer. I want to quickly go back because I did make a promise to Margaret that I would revisit her last point, which ties in really nicely with what you've all said, especially you made a comment to this reference as well. So you were just on the cusp of saying, Margaret, about how the perspectives of white conservative men and having their opinions changed by their daughters. And at the same time, Kevin, you also mentioned, interestingly enough, that most of the change has happened historically from the unexpected rupture points, the fact that it's never from the top down. And if our governments have known this information for decades and still don't act on it, how can we try and empower more people who are in unexpected positions to create that change? So that's open to all of you, but Margaret, if you'd like to lead that response, please.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with Kevin. I think all kinds of people who are not at the top sense change much earlier and much more viscerally and much more fiercely. And I think it's, the work of Erica Chenoweth that shows you actually need a vanishingly small number of people or percentage of the population to feel strongly about change for it to start to become action. But I do think that it's important to recognize that although I think we're all kind of aghast at how slow and passive the world has been in the face of climate change, it's also important to recognize that a lot of entrepreneurs have been working this problem from a tech perspective for 30 years, that a lot of the emerging technologies we have are not because they started yesterday, but because they started years ago. And so I think what we have to hope for is that we have this extremely messy response, totally unplanned, not nice and tidy, not come from a swanky consulting company, which is a combination of grassroots pressure, a lot of innovation from technology, from artists, from the interaction of technology and artists, and the kind of slow, large-scale responsiveness eventually from government. And to some degree, I guess, I've learned a lot by talking at length to a lot of AIDS activists about how they fought this terrible epidemic when the government didn't want to know, when money voted to help the gay community was never paid out, when undertakers would refuse to bury AIDS victims, when nobody was paying any attention, how they kept going. And how they kept going was that they tried everything. They tried smart things and crazy things. They tried political action, social action, medical action. They found everybody who was not helping them and attacked them. I mean, it's a blistering decade of action on one hand and passivity on the other. But ultimately what they did is they sat down with their opponents. So they sat down with healthcare companies and healthcare regulators and found a way to work together. And I think, and it doesn't give me any degree of comfort to say this, but I think it is a reality that yes, we have to keep putting on pressure. We absolutely cannot let the pressure stop. But ultimately, we are only going to address this huge problem, as Kevin so brilliantly outlined, by getting popular opinion, citizen action, entrepreneurs and business and government, and even, God help us, the fossil fuel companies, to put all their weight, knowledge, experience, and resources to solving the problem.
Thank you, Margaret. Kevin, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite good to have some areas of agreement and disagreement. So I agree with a lot of what Margaret had to say there. I will disagree with one part a little bit in a minute. But I think the first part, I mean, we're always looking up for leadership because leadership's told us that's where leadership comes from. The power system has said, we are the people that know how to look after you best. It's done that repeatedly. It thinks that the sun shines out of its own backside. It thinks that's where the ideas come from. It is, of course, wrapped in its own power, its own wealth, its own prestige. It's a mobile elite society. It's the Davos culture. And so many of us aspire to that. Look at the amount of climate scientists who fly around the world to speak on these events. You know, we're locked into that prestige, that we're trying to all claw our way up this slippery pole. Not all, sorry. There's a high degree of high portion of us, and particularly wealthy of us, trying to slide our way up this greasy pole. And we like to think something that we're worth it. You know, there is something special about us. And we do like to see the world as this pyramid with us at the top and the little people at the bottom. That's why we accept the ridiculously high salaries we do. You know, if we didn't think we justified them, then don't take them. It was in my view. That's why I have a lot of arguments with my professors. We're all overpaid as professors. But we take it because we like to think we're special. We're more important than support workers in the health system or whatever it happens to be. When it comes to the issue of emerging tech, I think actually emerging tech is helpful and also has been a huge part of the problem. I should say I'm trained as an engineer. I did my apprenticeship in the ship's engine rooms, and I used to design and build offshore oil platforms. So I like tech. But actually, we've had tech for a long time. We know how to make bicycles. We know how to make homes that don't require heating. We know how to make wind turbines. We know how to make small cars. We know how to make electric buses and trams. We don't need new tech in the way that it is always put forward. We need the existing tech to be put in place, and the major social changes as well that are necessary now because we've left this so late. The problem with the new tech is often the claim, we almost use that as an excuse for not using the existing tech. Certainly technology is important, things like energy storage. Even there we have quite a lot of existing tech we could be using. But actually across the board, we know what to do technically. We're just not prepared to do it because the elite of us in the world, particularly like our large houses and flying around the world and driving SUVs, and all of the prestige stuff comes with high levels of consumption. And the problem with climate change now is it asks questions about that cannot be resolved by technical substitution in the time frame that we have. And so we rely on the emergent tech to further delay any action on climate change. And I hear that almost daily from colleagues of mine in academia who are always talking about the next bit of tech around the corner, and as well from entrepreneurs and from business people, and repeatedly from people on Twitter who are always telling me it's some new bit of tech that's going to make electric planes available by next Wednesday. And there's always something just around the corner, another silver bullet. We know what to do. We know it's social change and structural change with the technologies we have today, but we haven't got the courage to do it. And when I say the we, I mean we in the positions of power.
Adam, I want to go over to you because you mentioned this in your reflection, the idea that we have the resources available, which Kevin has just said, but actually, ultimately, we're not ready to confront uncertainty and find a solution because we don't want to be uncomfortable. So can you talk a bit more about the psychology of that and how you've addressed it in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very paralyzing. I think it's all, you know, we're brilliant as humans to want to totally or two or more totally contradictory things at once, and you know, part of the complexity of being human is our ability to do that despite its contradictions. And I think the perception of what our impact will be and its kind of ripple effect away from us towards others, towards the natural world, into the future is not consistent. So we can sometimes think quite far ahead, but it's limited. There's a fantastic documentary film called Into Eternity by Michael Madsen from 2010, and it follows the construction of the Onkalo waste repository at a nuclear power plant on a Finnish island. And the scientists are having to try to imagine extending care to a future us, ensuring that the nuclear waste material will be safe for our future humans for a time span of over 100,000 years. And at the beginning of the documentary, they talk about how limited it is even for us to sort of think back. We can just about do 100 years, and we can maybe do sort of 20, 30 years in the future. So even, you know, those of us with children, grandchildren, or, you know, potential legacy of endless sort of generations leading off into the future, it's still quite difficult. We can kind of imagine them, you know, in this incredibly overheated world, or this world that's fighting for food, and yet that imagination can very quickly dissipate. I mean, the scientists in that documentary, they're very open about their own uncertainty, but they all seem to have one thing in common when they try to imagine into the future, and they intuit that that actually as a species we become more primitive. And yet, despite that, there's a care and empathy that arises from that imagination, and in spite of it, that massive duration of uncertainty is you know, an expression of wonder for them.
Thank you, Adam. Just to start to encourage the audience to think about your questions, you're welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A. But one of the ways as a warm-up is I'd like to ask you, we have some poll questions. I'd like to ask you one of them, which is, when it comes to climate change, is persuasion more important than fact? So just put that in as a stimulus question for you, for everyone to answer. And in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for responses, Adam, just to go back to what you were saying there about, although we can envision the impact it's going to have on the generations to come and on our family, it dissipates. Why do you think it dissipates? Is it a survival mechanism, or?
The dissipation, what, of imagination? Exactly,
and the consequence of what's going to happen. We all know it, but why are we kind of paralyzed?
I think it
right?
really I mean, as an artist and teaching art, you know, we're dependent on having these very, you know, hopefully very sort of flexible and fluid imaginations. But I've also taught young people who are excluded from school, and you see how quickly imagination gets completely eroded through trauma. If you've had bad experiences, or you're living in poverty, or reality is felt to be sort of precarious, unstable, and something to be feared, you're in a kind of fight or flight mode. So you haven't got the time or energy to start imagining, because that comes from a position of security. So there's something about a position of privilege and security that allows us the capacity to think our way out of a problem. And then, you know, again, is the sort of limit of where that imagination extends. Does it become an empathic attention, where we see the impact of our consumption and our behavior on other people that we can't see, way beyond us? Or is it an imagination which is just about a quite immediate short-term gratification of, I'd really like a bigger car, I'd really like a bigger house, you know?
Okay, I'm just waiting. Thank you, Adam. Just waiting for, whilst we're still waiting for the responses from the panel. Oh, they've arrived. So the poll reveals that 34% people do believe that when it comes to climate change, persuasion is more important than fact, compared to 23% of people that say no. But actually, the most interesting is that people are more nuanced, which is good to hear, and they believe it's similarly important. Just before I ask the next question from the audience, could you share with us if anyone has a varying or polarizing views on that? Maybe Margaret first, and then Kevin to respond, because I know that your work is an interesting dichotomy of the both of you. Do the work, you have the data, you're showing it, but somehow it's not resonating. So you're encouraging people to come up with unconventional approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book called Willful Blindness, which was absolutely about why do we ignore the obvious, right? And there are lots of reasons we ignore the obvious. Partly we hang out with people who ignore the same obvious things. Busyness is a fantastic way to ignore the obvious. You know, and Adam talked about trauma. I think much that's true of trauma is true of the way we work people, which is if you work people 8, 10, 20, 8, 10, 14 hours a day, and you work them weekends and you get them multitasking like maniacs, they will lose the ability to imagine, and they will lose the ability actually to think. This is very well demonstrated. Equally, we understand that people by and large are deeply conflict averse. They don't want to have arguments. So if all their friends and neighbors aren't talking about thinking about acting on climate change, they mostly won't bring it up. We're kind of social creatures. We like to get along. And mostly people don't want to have a fight. We have a kind of epic example of bystander behavior. We can all see it, but we think it's somebody's job to do something. It's just, thank God, it's just not our job. And I think, honestly, we have failed to have an honest conversation about sacrifice. I remember hearing Carolyn Lucas interviewed about, well, you know, all of this change that you're talking about, you know, isn't it going to involve sacrifice? And she said, well, is it sacrifice to have clean air and sacrifice to have clean oceans? And of course, this is logically disingenuous. Of course, having those things is not a sacrifice, but getting from the mess we're in now to there is going to involve sacrifice. And we may sneer at what people like and what they're used to. But the fact remains that for them, giving those things up, however we may be snide about them, for them, that's a sacrifice. And we have to call it out. And in some way, we have to appreciate it. You know, nobody went to the D-Day beaches and said, hey, it's all going to be a ton of fun. We're going to have a really nice day at the seaside, right? We have a gigantic problem here, and it is not going to be solved without sacrifice. And I think one of the huge mistakes we've made is to pretend that it can be.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to go to the questions because they're really interesting, and I want to give enough time to the audience. And I promised I'd go to you next, Kevin. So this is directed at you from Michael Corcoran. He says, Kevin has rightly pointed out that it's the inaction of governments that has brought us to this point of crisis. But where are the examples of this ground up exercise of agency? We've seen many examples of the exercise of the right to protest, and this is important, but this is bringing a clear expression of dissatisfaction of the actions or inaction of authority. It is not action. So he's talking about the conflict there between protest and not action. What are you?
Well, the problem there is there's often a lag between them. So I mean, there was a lot of people were arguing for votes for women for years before actually they got those votes for women. The problem with climate change, it's a cumulative problem. So we don't have that time for that lag, and that is a real issue that I think we're really struggling with here. So how do you, if actual major action is mobilized by communities and civil society driving political change, how rapidly can it do that? And I think it's actually quite interesting because I think there has been some action. I think if we look, for all of the banging on about climate change that scientists and the great and good have done for the last 30 odd years, what's made a big difference is a Swedish schoolgirl, youth movements, Extinction Rebellion, a whole ragtag of different groups of civil society. In a way I quite like, that's not immediately well coordinated. I think that's quite a good thing. But actually I now engage with councils who are saying, well, you can forget your committee on climate change and your net zero and what the UN are telling me. We want to go for net zero or real zero even by 2030 or by 2035. So actually local councils are putting in place agendas now that are much more challenging than the governments are proposing, or indeed some of the scientists who believe in future technology to suck CO2 out of the air are proposing. Now, I think it's also fair to say they're putting those in place and the action is not there. So the civil society pushing, I think it has changed the target agenda, or I would prefer to see it as the obligation, commitment or duty agenda. But I don't think yet it's actually made us realize how profound the changes are that we require. So when I work in Manchester, Andy Burnham's really up for all these sorts of changes, but I don't think he's seeing this is going to mean fundamental changes to the wealthy of us in society in and around the Manchester area, having to forgo our large houses and our large cars, and having to forgo that in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So we're not prepared yet to address that agenda. But I do think it is unfair to say that we're not seeing some significant shift in the political agenda being driven by various groups from within civil society. That has occurred, and has occurred incredibly quickly. I'm not an optimist at all about climate change. I like to see myself as a realist. I think we're going to go to hell in a handcart. But 2 years ago, I was thinking there are no positive signs. Within 2 years, I've seen more positive signs on climate change than the previous 25 years I've worked on it. And that's been driven by civil society. not by academics, not by climate scientists. We're part of that agenda, but primarily driven by different groups in civil society.
Okay, and thank you, Kevin. I'm going to pick up on the point of civil society because we have two questions that complement that and would like to hear an expansion on it. So we have Mark Hudson and Jane Lawson. So I'll read both their questions out and everyone's welcome to respond. Mark Hudson says, emotions are often collective. I've not heard anything, we've said some things, from the panelists about the role of community groups, campaigning groups, citizen groups in helping people process, understand, channel emotions. It would be good to hear. And also want to add to that Jane Lawson's question for everyone, which is, what do you think about collective ways to support ourselves to face the uncertainty and be better able to take action? For example, Extinction Rebellion's inclusion of honesty about climate anxiety as part of activism, or the role of involvement in social movements in moving people out of paralysis.
Do you have any easy questions?
I mean, this is really exciting, the questions that are coming in. They're all very stimulating. So you're allowed to take a moment to think about it anyway. It's fine.
So can I just say, I think what's quite interesting about these questions is that, or at least the two of them that you read out, is it seems to me, and I may be interpreting them incorrectly, but it seems to me, again, it's looking for a plan. Like how do we create a strategy on who's playing what part? And I think, and this may sound rather kind of abstract, but I think all of it counts. Every single bit of it counts. Community groups count. I'm responsible for the village I live in, for its response to climate change in our tiny village, and actually it's when you get people doing things that then they start getting informed. As they get more informed, they start doing more. Is that going to solve climate change? No, but it's actually having a kind of chain reaction. We're not going to solve this by a kind of elegant choreographed dance between local groups, council groups, national groups, international groups, protesters, and so on. It is going to be a bit of a mess, but actually what really matters is that nobody stops, that you start where you are, where you have impact and resources, and you keep the pressure on and you keep the innovation going. But I don't think you can choose, sort of tactically. I don't think we actually understand enough. You can't choose tactically, this is exactly the right place to start. I think you start where you have resources to offer and where you have people you can work with and where you have information that you can use. And that may be anything, it may be what it may be the company you work for, it may be the network that you have to offer. What I think you can't do is wait until you've got it all worked out.
If I understood it correctly, maybe I didn't. I wonder whether Mark, and it was Jane, wasn't it? Mark and Jane, I think. Mark was talking about the emotions behind some of this, and I got the impression that Jane was also touching on that about how do we deal with all of those sorts of challenges that are there. If I understood it correctly, it is a challenging and emotional thing to think about working on climate change, about the prospects for our children, about other species, what that we're doing, what we're actually doing to the world, not just on climate change, but the broader set of ecological disasters we preside over. And I think that's a really important question. And I think people respond very differently to that. I have colleagues who really find it deeply emotionally challenging and draining to work on climate change. As for me, I find I'm almost uplifting sometimes, but overall, draining when I'm doing it, but then I can turn off quite easily. So my psychology is such I can turn off and go cycling or rock climbing and I forget about it. And that's okay for me. It doesn't work for other people. So I do think we have to find ways for sort of self-preservation as we go through this very difficult process of driving change with a recognition of all the pain, heartache, and trauma that brings with it. And I think that often requires us to work collectively with other people. That doesn't mean to say we have to agree with them, though. What we have to have is the courtesy and openness to see that we will argue and discuss our disagreements, and we will try and be constructive about ways forward, and recognize that we have to stop and change our own views, and not just to hear things, but to listen to things. And I think if we can do that, if we can come together in some recognition that we might have a broad thrust in the same direction, but we're going to come at it from different angles, and that sense of honesty and integrity in there. I think that helps with preservation. But as I say, it's something I struggle with, because I don't think I suffer those problems I see in other people in civil society movements and other colleagues who really do find working on climate change deeply traumatic on a daily basis.
And I think, you know, I would just pick up on what Kevin said, because I know that, I mean, I absolutely concur in the sense that I've seen this also with friends and colleagues. And again, you know, I'd look back to the AIDS crisis, and there's no doubt that you had waves of activists who would get burned out, but they were replaced by new waves, you know. So, I mean, yes, of course, fighting for your life is emotionally traumatic. There's no doubt about it. But to the degree that you're doing it together, you know, you can pick each other up when we tire. I mean, that's how it's got to work. The point is, it's got to be relentless. Not that each of us individually can be relentless, but collectively we have to be.
I want to go to the question from Mark Goldthorpe, which is really pertinent to this conversation about, you know, imagining and responding to trauma and dealing with burnout. So Mark is asking, directing it to Adam first as well, if imagination is key to embracing uncertainty and responding to it, and imagination is eroded by experience of trauma, and more eco-climate trauma is ahead for so many of us, how do we act now to support and nurture the diversity of imaginations we will need from here on in to work with uncertainty and open it up in fruitful ways?
Wow, that's such a good question.
It's a great question.
Beautifully presented as well. Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking when we've been talking, particularly about the collective and about imagination, how at the beginning, you know, but particularly in Britain, at the beginning of the first lockdown, there was this sort of extraordinary amount of discussion about collectivity, that we were all, I mean, of course, we know that people had very, very different experiences of it, but in some way or another, everyone's life was affected and everyone had to come to a kind of stop. So there was a lot of discussion about this is the moment, there could be no more business as usual, the green recovery, all kinds of things, that this is a moment for transformation. And you know, in the same way Naomi Klein wrote about, and This Changes Everything, about this issue, you know, that Margaret was talking about as sacrifice. It seems like a sacrifice and it seems uncomfortable. And yet at the same time, this is a moment to change all kinds of other inequalities, because they're all connected and they're all bound up together. So a lot of that discussion was happening. And so there was something really odd about, you know, and also I think this question that people are asking themselves, well, everything's come to a stop. We're sort of out of this, you know, hamster wheel of constant production and constant stuff. Again, you know, for many of us, not for all of us. What is it that we really love? You know, what is it that we really want? There's all this stuff that we used to say that's what we like doing and how we wanted to spend our time and where we sort of located our pleasure. But really, was that what made us happy? So there was this, what felt like an incredible kind of tipping point, this huge amount of writing about it, an analysis of it, people's dreams, people's sleep. And then it just seemed to give way to something else, which was this sort of odd inertia. So the whole thing at the beginning seemed to catalyze this incredible imagination and perhaps an incredible opportunity. And then we now seem to be in this sort of odd kind of limbo, and then we're looking forward to things being eased, and all that stuff of no more business as usual seems to have gone back to a kind of more limited imagination, more short term. We just need to do our stuff back. We need to get back to work. We want to go to the cinema again, or whatever it is. And so it just seems to have sort of dissipated. But, you know, in recent collective memory, we have this memory of all having given up something and behaved in a different way. And that was a fantastic opportunity to say, okay, this is the moment. Okay, it wasn't that bad. You were able to do it, and you were able to stay in, and you were able to kind of give up all these things. therefore, why not sort of move that as a transition into acting very decisively towards climate change?
Adam, I just want to add into that because it's related Sophie King's question, which is about that moment. So she's asking, is the economic shock of COVID likely to help or hinder the necessary societal change to tackle the climate crisis?
Is that for me? I think Margaret, that's a great one.
I'm sorry, I got tongue twisted there. I
don't know anything about money.
I wanted to mention that as a follow-up because you mentioned there was this moment where, like you said, in recent memory, where we were all kind of excited about the potential. And there is still some shock from there. So just to add on that Sophie's comment is, how can we still kind of revive that union? You know, the fact that at one point we were all in synchronized with feeling like there's a potential for change, and use shock as a motivator.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I absolutely remember the moment Adam's talking about, and it was quite exciting. And then exactly as he says, it seemed to kind of peter out and people became rather nostalgic for offices and their commute and all this junk that they hated before. And I think the brutal answer is, I don't think we know. I don't think we know what the long-term effect of the lockdowns and COVID will turn out to be. I don't think we even know how we've changed, because you kind of can't know it until you see that you're behaving differently in front of friends, or they're perceiving you as different from what you used to be. I think that what I am seeing is a lot of propaganda about how everybody wants to go back to work and how everybody wants to go shopping and how everybody can't wait to eat out. And, you know, this is presented as though it were somehow fact. And I think really it is propaganda. It's kind of persuading people, no, you want to go back to capitalism as usual. You want to get back on the hamster wheel. Oh boy, don't you miss that hamster wheel? And, you know, and we'll see. Everybody has been changed by this, but I think what it has shown us, which is a salutary thing to see and to live through, is that whereas once upon a time there was this belief that, oh, people hate change and they can't change and they don't know how to change, and don't try to change people because they really can't do it. What we've seen is actually they really can when they know why. We've seen the most dramatic changes in human behavior in the last year. And they did that because people knew why. And, you know, and I think the clearer, louder, and more, you know, relentless we can be about why we have to stop eating meat, why we have to stop heating our homes, why we need smaller homes, why really everybody having a dog that eats meat twice a day is not really the greatest thing on the planet. You know, we have to start having really hardcore conversations about why we need to give up some of the things we're really used to. We've done it once. We did it this year. We can do it again. We can do it better.
A lot of agreement, but also some, I'm going to try and pull out maybe the bits of some disagreement as well, because it's something I was interested to pull those out. I think we're using the word we, I think, a little bit too much, like we're in some sort of collective whole here. I liked some of the early lockdown. I'm stuck now because I've had an accident on my bike and I can't go anywhere. But beforehand, I could go out cycling. So I was out cycling lots. It was lovely. I heard the birds, came back to my flat with all the lovely grounds, heard the birds outside. Wonderful. But of course, I'm incredibly privileged. If you live down in Glossop in one of the really awful little flats there with two people stuck in there, they don't see anything wonderful in that. These are the same people, of course, you know, evoking Robert Chastle's ragged shadows of philanthropists. These are the people paid a pittance who are the cleaners, the carers, the bus drivers, the security guards, the people that have died because of COVID and then going back home if they haven't died in the evening to live in their terrible flats. So I think we have to be really careful to separate out this way we've framed, not saying we're all doing it here, but there's an element sort of, you know, let's pin out the good things of COVID. It was a deep tragedy to many people. Lots of children, particularly poorer children, would have really suffered education as a result, whilst the posh kids would have been nicely tutored at home. So it increased even more inequality in our society. So in many respects, COVID it's great. It's signaled a real potential for change, but it's also signaled the deep endemic inequalities in our life. And we're simply not prepared to accept them now. And that's where I think the sacrifices exist. Because I think we can imagine, I can postulate futures. I can have an imagination that can see poorer people living in the local town of Glossop or other parts in the UK who have much more secure jobs from the infrastructure changes that we've got to bring about. So not only call centres, they're actually retrofitting our houses, they're fitting new transport systems, they're doing all the things we need to do physically. So they've got secure long-term employment. When I cycle out through Cheshire, past all the gated ghettos where vice chancellors and football players and all the wealthy in our society live behind their locked gates with 2 4-wheel drives and a sports car behind it, for them, and for people like me who live nice lives as well, it is undoubtedly a sacrifice. Remember, when we talk about the clean beaches we spoke about before, I can go to the clean beaches. Wealthy people like me, we just fly around the world to the clean beaches. The poor people don't. They go to the places where there's no flag of cleanliness for the water there. And so I think we have to unpick this and say that particularly in many parts of Europe, we see this, and the US, deep endemic levels of inequality at every single level. And we're not really prepared to address that issue. Climate change is a bit, and it's like COVID, there are lots of crossovers. The poor people who were the ones who suffered from COVID and have actually were the key workers are also low emitters.
Kevin, I just have to interject because of time, and we also have another program in exactly 1 minute. Luckily, the virtual world allows us to just jump over. I think that's a really salient point for us to summarize on and reflect on, the importance of acknowledging nuance. Of as much as this brings opportunity, the chaos, it's also created a lot of, and actually highlighted the chasm between us and society. And we should be more mindful of that, which is precisely why the idea of democratizing climate change needs to come from all over society. So I think that's a really a great point for us to close on and reflect on. I'd like to close by saying a massive thank you to Invisible Dust for bringing this program together. Thank you to Adam, Kevin, and Margaret for your contributions. And for those of you who are still around, we have a program this evening, a performance by Adam Chodzko. The next event is starting in exactly 1 minute, so you can join. There is a link that's been shared. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.